Hello and welcome to the second part in this tutorial about how to create responsive layouts for web pages. Here's a quick look at the final product that we are recreating in these tutorials, and here's a look of how far we have gotten in the first part. If you haven't watched the first part, I highly recommend that you go back and watch that before watching this episode. Before we start, I just need to fix an embarrassing error from the first part. For some reason I have forgotten closing quotes on two of the attributes in the search form. And now, when that's out of the way, let's take a look at the styling of the search form. We can see that the text field and the search button doesn't align very well to each other, and they also need to have the same height. So in our style sheet below the rules for the search form, we will create some rules for all the input elements in the search form. We will give the inputs a height of 30 pixels. We can see now the element have the same height, but the alignment is still not in place. So we're gonna add a vertical align property to the elements and align it to the top. If you want to remove the default borders around input elements that many browsers produce, you can either select all your inputs, or you can use the type selector. If you want, for instance, a submit button not to have border, then you just specify inputs with the type submit and set the border to none. You should also notice that I have no line breaks or white space between the input elements in the form. And that is because they are inline elements, so space in the markup would also produce space in the layout. And we want the elements to be right next to each other. Now I will set up some rules for typography. We will specify an initial font size value for the HTML element, and we will set it to 16 pixels. For all other elements we will use relative M. That way they will all be relative to this initial value. We will also set up our main font family for the HTML element. Down in our typography block area here, I will add some style rules for the headings. For the sake of this tutorial, I will only specify rules for H1, H2 and H3. I want the headings to have a serif font family because it will produce a nice contrast to the sans serif body copy. Yeah, we can't actually see the contrast now because we have no headings. So I'm gonna replace this placeholder text with something that resembles actual content a little more. Remember, we have those two text files, and I'll just copy the main text and paste it into our main element. And I'll just try to indent it a bit here and close it. The other text file contains content for the sidebar, and we will paste that into our aside element. We can see that we also need to create the page heading and the banner. In the div with the full width class, I'm gonna create a H1 element. Then I will insert the banner image. And give it an alt attribute. We can see all the headings need some padding. For the H1 element, I will give it 1 relative M for top-bottom padding and 0 for left-right padding. And for the H2 and H3 elements, I will specify 0.6 top-bottom and 0 left-right. I think the default bold doesn't look good with the headings, so I will give them a font weight of normal. I will also specify a size to ensure consistent sizes across all browsers. And here I'm using relative M's, And because we've specified 16 pixels for our HTML element, then one unit here will be 16 pixels and 2 will be 32. When we add a font size, it's also a good idea to add a matching line height in case some headings should span over multiple lines. For the menu elements, I would like the links to appear in uppercase, but you should never type words in uppercase because screen readers will pronounce every single letter then. So instead we'll just add a text transform property to our list elements with the value of uppercase. When we resize the page, the navigation is always visible, but we actually want the menu to be hidden on smaller screens, like we can see here in the original template, and then have this toggle button that can open and close the menu. For this purpose, we will set up some style rules here in the display classes. I will create a class for the menu called hidden on mobile, and I will give it a display property with the value none. But we want the class to appear on wider screens, so in our first media query we will give the same class value of display block. We will also need a visible on mobile class that we can assign to the menu when the button is pressed, and that should just be present in our initial CSS and have a value of display block. Now I'm just creating the toggle button itself. In the markup, I'm using an image element. If you want your code to be very semantic, you should maybe use a button instead and then style it with a background image. But one way we can make our image a bit more semantic is by adding a role attribute with a value of button. We will also add a class name to the element, and we will need an ID. Right now the image is way too big, and it's visible both on wide and narrow screens. So we will style the toggle menu class, and first of all I would like to have it positioned absolute because I don't want it to add height to our header. Then I will go to our first media query and I will set the element to not be displayed on wider screens. And this is exactly what we want. We only want the button to be visible on small devices. We'll just have to specify a more natural size. Let's give it the same dimension as the search button, which was 30 pixels width and height. We can also change the cursor to pointer when it's hovered over the element. And then I just need to adjust the margin a bit to have it aligned with the search form. In order to have something to actually happen when we press the button, we will need to add some JavaScript. The easiest way to select DOM elements with JavaScript is if they have an ID. So we will give our unordered list an ID of menu items. We will also make sure that the element is hidden before the button is pressed. So we will add the hidden on mobile class name to it. Remember, elements can have multiple class names. Now we will create a script element just before the closing body tag. Here we will create an event listener that will execute when the page has loaded and invoke a function called attach menu toggle. And we will of course have to create the function, and it's good practice to declare a function before it's called. The function will contain two variables that references our elements. The first element is a button, so I'm just gonna grab the ID from the source code. The second variable will be the menu, and I believe the ID was menu items. We will then attach an event listener to the button, and that will of course be a click event, and it will invoke a function that we will call menu handler. We will create the new function within the scope of the existing function. because we need access to the variables. The menu handler function will contain an if block and an else block. In the if block's conditions, we are going to evaluate the class name of the menu element, and we need to grab both class names. If the class names are equal to menu items hidden on mobile, then we're going to change the class name to menu items visible on mobile. And else, we're going to change the class name back to hidden on mobile. That way every click on the button will toggle between the visible and hidden class. Okay, now we have actually created a layout of the sites that works nice on all sorts of devices. Of course, there's a lot of details that we could touch up on. Right now I'll just add a little bit of box shadows to some of the elements, which has nothing to do with responsive design, but I'll do it anyway because it's fun. Let me just say about the menu toggle function. If you don't feel comfortable about using JavaScript, there is actually a CSS solution, and I will leave a link in the video description. It's a kind of a hacky solution, but it works fine. So it's really up to you whether you want to use the JavaScript or the CSS solution. They both work fine, so check the link in the description. In the video's description you will also find a link for all the source files that we have been creating in this tutorial, including the images and icons. Finally, let me just explain, as promised, why I use those relative REMs for all the font measurements. The cool thing about it is that you only have to change the font size one place. Now I'm changing it for the HTML element, and because we have specified all other values in relative REMs, then when we change the font size, the other elements would change accordingly. That makes it very easy if we want to increase the font size a little bit on wide screens here. We only have to change the pixel value here for our HTML element. All the headings will scale up correctly to match this font size. Okay, this concludes this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and if so, give it a like and feel free to write a comment if you have any questions. Thank you for watching.